Dan, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to
Oh,
do this. I know you're
of
super
course. This is
busy.
this. No, this stuff is fun though. I like it.
You've done a lot of research on what I would call the possibilities and perils of teaching with online tools. You bring a bit of optimism, but also realism and a little bit of skepticism to the field of using online tools. So I'm wondering if, before we get to the perils, which we will talk about later, could you tell us about some of the possibilities of using online tools for social studies and history education?
Sure. And if you're okay, if you'll humor me for a moment, I'll start with a bit of an academic answer. Right. This is
Okay.
this is what you get when anyone kind of studies something. Right. They have a lot of a lot of thoughts that don't get right to the point. But I think because I think it's really important to first think about what we mean by technology. Right. And I think
Hmm.
that actually is really helpful in being intentional about how we then think about technologies we use or choose not to use. And
Right.
so big picture, right? Humans are tool users, right? We've kind of dominated all the other species in that regards, right? Like, you can, if you get a really smart elephant, they can scratch themselves with a stick, but that, otherwise, that's kind of the thing that really separates us, right? And so, I like to think about the different categories of technologies we can think about that affect our lives. So I'll start there real quick, and then I promise I'll work into thinking about these positive ways we can use
Hmm.
technologies. So I really like Nicholas Carr wrote a book called The Shallows, which is if you haven't read it, it really is focused on thinking about how the use of the internet every day really affects the way we think. Right? It's really potentially even changing the way that we interact in the world and the way that we think about things, and really shifted. So it's a way of thinking about us not just as people who use the internet, but as internet people in a sense, right? Like the internet is part of who we are now, right? When
Hmm.
we think of gathering or getting information, we immediately turn to the internet. Just like a lot of people, when they think of moving around society, they immediately think of cars, right? Of as the way that they will do so, right? And
Hmm.
so there's different types of technologies. There's technologies that can increase like your physical attributes. Usually that doesn't come into play in the classroom. That's like the plow or the tractor, or things that like allow you to do things you otherwise wouldn't be able to do, right? Even the car would be a good example, right? It allows you to travel at faster speeds. There's technologies that enhance your senses. Those actually can be useful in the classroom because it could be things like a microscope. It can be things, potentially even that allow you to see places you wouldn't be able to see, right? So like see in a distance. Google Earth would be a great example, right? Like you can now, your vision is extended to be able to
Hmm.
see the world in places you wouldn't be able to see, just of course with your limited vision.
Hmm.
We can reshape nature, although that surrounds like our school environment, right? Which by the way is all technologies. The classroom is uses girders and support to create these enclosed environments we sit in, oftentimes, unfortunately, in schools without windows. I know that was my classroom experience. And then lastly, technologies can increase our intellect. And this is a lot of what we use in schools, right? Is technologies that allow us to find and classify information, to formulate or articulate ideas, to share knowledge or to make calculations, right? And expand the capacity of our memory, right? So you think even just the technology of writing, right? Writing down history has
Hmm.
been profound
Hmm.
for our field. But of course, the map is too, right? It changes the way we think of space. The clock changes the way we think of our time within the classroom. The newspaper changes the way we think of current events. And so there's a lot of technologies that are involved. And so when we're discussing technologies in schools, we're often discussing something very specific, which is emerging digital technologies, right?
Hmm.
Because
Hmm.
we tend to focus on the new technologies. And so when we think of that, I think the thing that's been really helpful for me to think about some of the possibilities is to think through, why am I using a technology?
Hmm.
There's a bunch of different models for doing that. My favorite one is a model called PICRAT, and it was developed by Royce Kimmons and a few other people at BYU, and it's just PICRAT, and it's a little acronym that educators can use. And they have a really good article in the Site Journal, CITE journal.org is where you can find it, that was published in 2020. The article is just called The PICRAT Model for Technology Integration and Teacher Preparation. And there's other models that are out there. Some of the famous ones you may have heard of are TPAC or SAMR or
Mhm.
some of these, or even rat, and this is an extension of one called rat. And so let me explain the two parts of this model, because this
Mhm.
really helps you identify when a technology is positive. And the thing I
Mhm.
like about this pick rat model is that they don't take a stance on technology, right? It's really about the teacher thinking through their decision
Mhm.
making about
Mhm.
using technology. So
Mhm.
on the teacher's side, you can think about the rat component is, does the technology replace
Mhm.
what you would otherwise use? Does it amplify what you would
Mhm.
otherwise use, or does it transform what you would otherwise use, right?
Mm.
So
Mhm.
how does the technology affect things, right? So sometimes you may realize that you're using a technology that really is just replacing it without any meaningful added benefit of using the technology, and maybe it would be simpler not to use it, right?
Could you give an
But
example?
sure. So let me. I'll give. How about? Can I give a bad example? So
Okay.
one time I saw. So we're going to get to the positives, right? The ways you
Mhm.
use it. But one time I saw a teacher doing a presentation who talked about like teaching their students about coins and the value of coins and meaning of them and stuff. And they put the coins on a PowerPoint slide to discuss them with their students. Well, I quickly
Instead of
thought,
just holding the
you know
coin
what
in
would
your
be
hand.
better,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, is to pass coins around the room and
Yeah.
let students hold them and look at them, right?
Right.
And so the technology really didn't amplify anything or replace anything, right? Now, sometimes let's just use the example of slides, right? So slides can give you a common vision in the classroom, and they can allow
Mhm.
people to have access to common information at the same time, right? That was
Mhm.
actually the transformation that chalkboards made in the 1800s, which were seen as like a huge disruptive technology in schools at the time, right? Kids had individual little things they wrote on. That was their one to one of their era, right? The
Mhm.
individual little chalkboards at their desk. But to have a common visual space really allowed them to learn together in a different way,
Mhm.
right? To talk through things together. Now, whether that's always used well is a whole nother story,
Right.
right? So when the teacher thinks about which technology you want to use, right, you can think about, are these slides replacing what I would do otherwise, right? So maybe handing out the coins, maybe sharing information, does having it up amplify something? So, for example, if you have students if your class is primarily conducted in English and you have students whose English is their second language, right? Having, for example, key terms that you're discussing on the slides can actually really amplify your lesson, because it can allow them that, keeping those words up there allows them to sit there and look at them and work through those words at their own pace, right? So
Mhm.
that's an amplification. Now, what would it look like for slides to transform the lesson, right? Now, maybe this is where you have a photograph, right? Like, say you put up a full screen photograph of an
Mhm.
important historical moment, and you all explore it together. To
Mhm.
me, what that can potentially do. Now, could you give everyone a copy of the photograph? Yeah, so you could argue that this just amplifies it by making it a more communal discussion. Um, but so transforming is really when you're doing something that you couldn't do without the technology.
It also makes it larger so you can see all
Right.
the elements. I mean, if it's the size of the wall or, a quarter of the
Mhm.
wall, that's really different from looking at a small image.
Now, if you wanted to say how does it transform, so if you're actually using one of those smart boards to do work with the photograph, so right, so
Mhm.
you allow students to come up and you identify things and draw on it, to have that common visual field, it potentially could allow you to do something that just would not be possible otherwise, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
so that's from the teacher side. The student side is just thinking about their relation. So this is the pick part. The PIC
Mhm.
is, are the students passive, are they interactive, or are they creating? They use the term creative, but I always think creating makes more sense. So there's not a right or wrong here earlier either, right? Like, by the way, sometimes watching a really good video, it's kind of can be a passive experience. But if it's a
Mhm.
really good video, right? Like, I'm influenced. I watch really great videos sometimes, and they change the way I think about something.
Mhm.
You could make it interactive by adding in some collective note taking, although that's a plus and minus thing. I always think that note taking is a bit overrated in schools. Like, when I think about the things I've learned that are most important, it's okay to forget some things, I guess is what I would say. Um, and then creating, are they actually creating something, right? So are the students making something? And so what you think through is you think about the teacher's role. Are you replacing does the new technology replace something old? Is it amplifying what you would use, or is it transform? And for the students, is their experience passive, interactive, or creative? And so just thinking through those possibilities, I think, allows you to make good decisions for your class. To me, the biggest thing is, are you doing the same thing all the time?
Mhm.
Right? Like, are the students always passive? and you're like
Mhm.
showing them videos, or you're having them read your notes where they do very little interaction on their own. Do you ever allow them the opportunity to create something, for example, to create a video or a podcast or something as a way to show their understanding and growth on some social studies topic?
Well,
So
in that sense, it
yeah.
relates to the extent to which teachers are meeting their objectives. So if they think through this, they can think about, oh, okay, if I can find a technology that enables students to create something, then that can be one of my objectives that could demonstrate student learning. And in a sense, it could
Mhm.
be a formative assessment.
Yeah, and then there's also can be other benefits to doing so, right? So, for example, when I start my classes, I put a lot of emphasis on learning each other's names, right?
Hmm.
I think that our names are important parts of our identity. Names are
Hmm.
racially coded, oftentimes,
Hmm.
right? Students oftentimes, if they have kind of like typically white Christian names, tend to be a bit easier. Biblical names tend to be a bit quote unquote easier for people to say. And so the question is, I think it's a good social studies question: how do we create an inclusive, equitable classroom? And so
Hmm.
one assignment that I do in my classroom is I send them instructions ahead of time, and we each tell a name story. And so what they do is they start the name story by pronouncing their name correctly, and then they tell a story about their name, and it's totally their choice, right? They can tell any
Hmm.
type of story, from the meaning of it to why their parents or guardians gave it to them to their relationship with their name. The only rules is you can't pronounce your name incorrectly. I literally will bleep it out if you do it, like when I go back. But what happens is I literally pass around a device, either my phone or a tablet, record this, and then the benefit here is not only that we could have told our name stories in class, but what the name story podcast does is I go and edit it after, is we can all go back and listen to it at any time. So it becomes a resource for our class. And I always do it in an order so they can go find somebody's name if they don't know. So I tell them, if you don't know someone's name, pronounce it on your own time, practice it on your own time. Don't do it in front of the classroom. And I always
Hmm.
tell them I learn names by on my bike ride to class. Before class, I ride my bike and sit there and practice their names on the way to class to make sure I know them. So I look crazy if they see me like pronouncing names while I'm riding by.
Hmm.
But so there can be benefits, right, to creating certain things that you want to last, or you want to be able to refer back to, for study later or for other things. And so I think that's another
Hmm.
added benefit, is thinking about, are we creating stuff then that we can refer back to or use later too?
Hmm. Well, this theoretical framework is very helpful. PICRAT. The PIC is for passive, interactive, or creating. Is that right? That's for the from the
Yeah.
student perspective, and RAT
Yep.
is for from the teacher perspective: replace, amplify, or transform. Really
That's it.
cool.
And I have a little activity. If anyone just sends me an email, I'll be happy to
Hmm.
share with them. I have an activity that I use, if you're especially if you're a teacher educator, right? That I use with my teacher candidates to prepare.
Hmm.
And you can so whenever you're using a technology, you can have them practice it, and it's got like the things where they fill out and they choose. But it's really simple, and there's a great video with the article. So if you go to the site journal go to sitejournal.org and you look at their article, if you scroll down, there's a video, like a 4-minute video. You can really just show your students that, and then it's really easy from there, because it's a nice animated video that allows you to then start talking about the decisions you're making about which technologies to use.
Hmm.
And I think for a lot of us, technologies can be really powerful in the classroom if your purpose is clear, and if the reasons you're using it kind of match up with that purpose.
Hmm. So, in case there are any techno skeptics in the audience, or people who might hesitate to invest, as you said, in teaching their students how to make videos or make podcasts, what would you say about the research uh, support for using this to enhance student learning and
Mhm.
understanding? Do you think
You
it's a
know,
net gain? And there's some people who, we always have to think about, I mean, in certain contexts, teachers are thinking about what the students have to do on a standardized test
mhm.
or what they'll need to do for next year. What would you say about what these types of projects and formative assessments could do for students' learning and engagement?
Right, and I always focus on the learning component. I always say I'm a professor of education, not a professor of teaching, of testing, because
Or
it's such a.
technology?
I'm really bad, because I struggle to, like, when people are like, "Well, I have a test," and it's like hard, because I'm like, "Well, what do you want me to do?" Like, and sometimes what people want you to do is to create lessons that cover a massive amount of material really quickly. And I do understand the challenges teachers have. I remember I did it. Um, but yeah, I think I would say that it's it just depends on the skills and experiences you want your students to have, right? Being able to walk out of a classroom with some video creation skills, it can be beneficial in the class and beyond it, right? It's a really cool skill for students to do, but it's also like a way to get students kind of excited. As you said, the term used is engaged, right? With learning, because the creation process is a storytelling process, honestly, right? That's why I'm a big advocate of having students create. I like to use creation programs like iMovie, podcast editing like on programs like Audacity, which is free to use.
Hmm.
I often use green screens. There's really good stop motion apps which you could do to make kind of some different types of videos. You could do voiceovers for slides or things like that. And so I think whenever you have students using creation programs, that you're really requiring them to really think through things in a different way than we often do, right? You're putting a lot of responsibility with them, because telling a story oftentimes is a way to make sense of what you're learning and to think about new questions for it. So I would say that a lot of these creation tools, whether they're collaborative or they're for creating media, can really be really powerful. And of course, there's a lot of other great sites and stuff online that I haven't even mentioned, right? There's great primary source sites like Docs Teach. I hope people use that in social studies, like and Chronicling America. If people have never been to that site, those are both Library of Congress sites. Chronicling America is like basically newspapers from the late 1700s
Hmm.
to I think the 1960s now. They've been expanding and expanding it. Docs Teach and Chronicling America allow students to do a lot of historical work too. There's other really good engaging sites. Smithsonian Learning Labs. If people haven't used that, they have great curated, they have a lot of different types of primary sources, right? They show you a lot of the ones that are in museums, right? So you can find specific things when you search for them that are in museums, a lot of photographs. And then they also put together sets of documents and things, right, that are really helpful for teachers, because then you can give students those sets and ask them to make sense of them. Google Arts and Culture is another pretty good site. There's some there's some intellectual technologies, right, that allow us to see things we couldn't see otherwise in the classroom.
As you were talking about the storytelling tools, it struck me that some of these tools could be, or technologies could be, valuable ways for students to develop their civic voices. You know,
Mm-hmm.
their ways of sharing their perspectives on the world, problems that they see in their society, ways that they imagine addressing issues in their communities, ways of proposing solutions, and reaching a broader audience. I'm
Yeah,
wondering if
absolutely.
you have suggestions for, certain what are certain tools or technologies that they could use for learning how to do podcasting
Mm-hmm.
or video apps. You talked about apps that allow you to do certain kinds of things. And I've been playing around with apps recently and was kind of amazed at how easy they were to use. You know, you just look at the different options and you can make things look a certain way,
Mm-hmm.
and editing is not that hard. What are some that are free that you think would be easy for teachers to integrate into their classrooms for either video or podcasting, video or audio?
Well, one thing you can do is also ask students what sites they're using, right?
Hmm.
If they're YouTubers, then you could talk about how you could use it, right? Of course, one thing I focus on a lot is always exploring the techno ethical issues around any of these platforms. YouTube's highly problematic. Their algorithms tend to direct people to all kinds of um, you know, problematic content. That's most social media sites that it's they used to say in the newspapers, if it bleeds, it leads. Right, on social media,
Yeah, yeah,
if it gets attention, it's going
yeah.
to be it's going to be in the algorithms and amplified. Unfortunately, the thing that seems to get attention is things like fear. You know what I mean? Things that scare us,
I do, and
things
that
that are
raises
hateful.
another
Yeah.
dilemma. Yeah. Hmm.
So I think one way to think, I actually have a lesson that I did with Marie Heath that you can use. We have sources for this, where what we do is we compare the Black Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 60s and the strategies, the tactics they used for change, and then
Hmm.
we compare that with the Women's March movement in 2017, and we look at the differences between the type of strategies. And this whole lesson is really based on Zainab Tufekci's Twitter and Tear Gas book, where she does a lot of that work, and she talks about. I think, and this is really important to not think of technologies just as tools, right? But think about
Mm-hmm.
technologies as having both benefits and downsides.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dan, this has been fascinating. Is there anything else you think educators should hear about? And, you might be talking to educators, parents, teacher educators. Anything you'd like to share?
I guess I would just say my approach is to always think about how not only how we can teach with technologies, but how we can teach about them, right? So don't take for granted that the technology is always doing something positive. In fact, think about how it's affecting people. And I often find it really productive to think through the downsides of a technology too, right? Oftentimes we think about the affordances, but we don't think about the constraints. And so when you think about the downsides, it oftentimes can be helpful to think and sometimes think about what would happen if I took this technology out of the class. What would be the different option that would be
Mm-hmm.
possible? Sometimes the best decision you can make is to use less technology, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we put so much time into doing something when the easiest thing to do in a classroom is to have a conversation without a bunch of digital distractions, right? And or be a storyteller as a teacher. And so I think just raising our awareness around those and the effects technologies are having on us can help us become better teachers when we do decide to use technology.
Dan, thank you so much. It's been a really interesting conversation, and thanks for all your work and for taking the time to do this.
Thanks. It was fun talking.